Gauze isn't supposed to crunch. That was Camilla's very first thought when she pressed her hands to the chest of the man screaming on table 3. He had broken 2 orderlies' jaws and spat on the head surgeon. Then she leaned in, whispered one word, and the screaming finally stopped. Fluorescent lights buzzed with a dying, erratic frequency. Camilla stood in the cramped supply closet of Forward Operating Base Delta, methodically tearing 2-inch strips of medical tape and sticking them to the edge of a stainless steel cart. Rip, stick, rip, stick. It was a grounding ritual. Outside the closet, Trauma Bay 4 smelled of industrial bleach, stale coffee, and the sharp, undeniable tang of unwashed bodies. She was 26, running on 4 hours of chemical sleep, and her right shoulder throbbed deeply from hauling a 200-pound artilleryman onto a gurney the night before. Camilla wasn't a hero. She lacked the Florence Nightingale complex that naive recruits brought off the transport planes. She was here because the hazardous duty pay cleared her crippling nursing school debt, and because dealing with blown-out limbs in a desert felt slightly more honest than pushing overpriced pills in a sanitized suburban clinic. She didn't care about the geopolitics that put these men in the dirt. She cared about inventory. She cared that they were running dangerously low on O-negative blood, and that the laundry unit hadn't sent back clean scrubs in 3 days. The double doors of the trauma ward blew open. Rubber soles squeaked violently against the sticky linoleum. "Incoming! Move, move, move!" Camilla dropped the roll of tape. The cheap adhesive stuck to her thumb, pulling at the dry skin before she violently shook it off. She stepped out of the closet just as a gurney crashed through the swinging doors, driven by 3 sweating medics who looked like they had just run a marathon in body armor. On the gurney was a man who looked less like a human patient and more like a cornered, wounded animal. He was massive, his frame spilling over the edges of the narrow cot. He was clad in charred tactical gear that smelled nauseatingly of cordite, diesel fuel, and burned hair. He wasn't crying out in pain. He was snarling. A low, guttural vibration that Camilla actually felt in her own chest from 10 feet away. "Hold him down!" Dr. Thomas Allen yelled, jogging alongside the gurney, his stethoscope bouncing wildly around his neck. Allen was a clinically capable surgeon, but he lacked bedside manner on a good day. Today, with someone else's blood splattered across his glasses, he looked entirely frantic. The man on the gurney thrashed. A thick nylon strap had been thrown over his chest, but the plastic buckle groaned under the sheer physical strain. His left arm shot out, bypassing the restraint. The back of his fist connected flush with a medic's jaw. A sickening crack echoed over the noise. The medic folded instantly, dropping to the floor like a sack of wet cement. "Get another strap! Get him secured!" Allen barked, ducking as the man's right leg kicked out, catching the edge of a rolling instrument tray. The tray flipped. Scalpels, clamps, and heavy metal trauma shears clattered to the floor in a deafening, chaotic wave of noise. Camilla stayed pressed against the tiled wall. Her heart hammered a frantic, irregular rhythm against her ribs. Look at him. His face was obscured by thick soot and a heavy smear of dirt, but his eyes were wide, blown out, and completely feral. He was bleeding heavily from a massive laceration across his abdomen. The Kevlar plate carrier had been shredded by shrapnel, pushing synthetic fibers, desert sand, and jagged metal deep into the exposed muscle tissue. "Sir, you're in a hospital. You need to stop moving!" Allen shouted. He leaned over the thrashing man with a pair of shears, desperately trying to cut away the ruined vest to access the wound. The man reached up and grabbed Allen's wrist. The bone didn't snap, but Camilla saw Allen's knees buckle from the sheer, crushing force of the grip. The surgeon let out a high, reedy gasp, dropping the shears. "He's tearing his own stitches from the field patch!" "Sarah," the charge nurse shouted, backpedaling away from the flailing limbs. "He's bleeding out! Dr. Allen, his pressure is dropping!" He was a mercenary. Camilla knew the type immediately. They operated in the grey zones, outside the official chains of command and accountability. They didn't wear flags on their shoulders. They didn't play by standard engagement rules, and they rarely trusted anyone in a uniform, even a medical one. This man was drowning in a flood of adrenaline, trapped inside whatever violent nightmare had put him on that gurney. He didn't see doctors and nurses trying to save his life. He saw threats moving in for the kill. "Sedate him! Give me 50 of ketamine right now!" Allen rasped, his face pale as he blindly pulled and wrenched his trapped wrist. "His pressure is tanking, Dr. Allen. 50 of ketamine will stop his heart." Camilla yelled. The words tore out of her throat before she could filter them. She hated speaking up, hated the attention, but basic biology couldn't be ignored. "If we don't get this vest off and pack that wound, he's dead anyway." Allen snapped back. He finally wrenched his wrist free, stumbling backward and knocking hard into Camilla. Camilla stumbled. Her hip caught the sharp metal edge of table 3. Pain flared, dull and heavy, but the impact grounded her. She looked back at the mercenary. He was panting heavily, his chest heaving with wet, ragged breaths. The nylon strap over his chest finally gave way with a loud snap. He sat up halfway, a feral beast ready to tear through anyone who came near. But as he moved, a heavy silver chain slipped from beneath his blood-soaked olive-drab undershirt. It didn't hold standard-issue military dog tags. It held a single, small, blackened metal disc, the shape of a bird in flight, its wings jagged, pierced cleanly by an arrow. Camilla's breath hitched in her throat. The chaotic room seemed to suddenly shrink. The erratic buzzing of the fluorescent lights faded into a dull, distant drone. The overpowering smell of copper and sweat receded. All she saw was that blackened metal disc resting against his collarbone. Corvus Company, 14 months ago. Outpost Echo. A metal shipping container converted into a makeshift comms hub, smelling constantly of ozone, burning dust, and stale energy drinks. Camilla had worked the midnight rotation, a headset clamped over her ears, staring at green radar blips. Corvus Company had been operating 50 miles outside the wire. No official transponders, no backup. She remembered the radio static crackling to life at 0300 hours. The deep, unhurried voice that identified itself only as Wraith. They would run standard comms checks, but over the weeks, those checks had turned into quiet, late-night lifelines. He had a voice like grinding stones, but he sounded like a man who had long ago forgotten how to panic. Camilla had listened to him navigate ambushes, guide his men through minefields, and report casualties with a stoic, crushing heaviness, until the night the mortar sirens went off on his end. The radio had screamed with the sound of tearing metal, and then nothing, just dead air. For 14 months, dead air. Camilla had locked herself in the latrine that night, silently mourning men she had never seen, haunted by the ghost on the radio. She looked at the man bleeding out on the table, the sharp jawline beneath the grime, the broad, corded shoulders. He was breathing in short, jagged gasps, his hands curled into white-knuckled fists. He was bleeding dangerously fast. The makeshift field dressing on his abdomen was completely saturated, a dark, terrible red pooling rapidly on the sterile blue sheet beneath him. "Drawing up the ketamine!" Sarah called out, her hands shaking violently as she flicked the edge of a syringe. "Wait," Camilla said. She didn't shout. It was a quiet, almost fragile word, but it somehow cut through the heavy chaos of the trauma bay. She stepped forward. "Williams, step back. He's delirious and violent," Allen warned, massaging his bruised wrist, his eyes darting to the armed guard lingering nervously by the door. Camilla ignored the surgeon. Her own hands were trembling. Her natural instinct in moments of pure conflict was to shrink, to blend into the sterile white walls and let louder, stronger people handle the damage. But she kept moving forward anyway. Her right foot caught the heavy plastic tubing of a discarded saline line. Her knee hit the linoleum. Hard. Pain shot up her thigh, but she scrambled back up, feeling the sudden flush of heat in her cheeks, the burning embarrassment of being clumsy in a room full of people fighting death. Not exactly a commanding presence. She thought bitterly. She approached the head of the gurney. The mercenary tracked her movement instantly. His eyes, a pale, washed-out grey under the harsh overhead lights, locked onto hers. The hostility radiating from him was a physical weight, a wall of pure kinetic threat. "Don't touch me," he rasped. The voice was wrecked, torn up by smoke inhalation and dehydration, but the cadence, the deep, resonant timbre, was unmistakable. It sent a freezing shock down Camilla's spine. It was him. She stopped just out of his reach. She didn't raise her hands in a placating, surrender gesture. She kept them down, visible by her sides. "You're bleeding out," she said. Her voice wavered. She cleared her throat, swallowing hard to force the tremble down. "We need to pack the wound. Let us pack the wound." Said, "Don't touch." He grunted, baring teeth stained with his own blood. His hand twitched toward his right thigh, instinctively reaching for a sidearm that had long since been stripped from him. "Sarah, the dart," Alan commanded tightly from behind her. Camilla took a half-step closer, recklessly putting her own body between the surgeon and the mercenary. A foolish, deeply unprofessional move. He grabbed her. His hand shot out and locked around her upper arm. His fingers felt like industrial iron clamps, digging painfully through her scrubs and into her bicep. Camilla let out a sharp, involuntary gasp. The grip bruised her flesh instantly, a deep, radiating ache that made her eyes water. With terrifying ease, he yanked her downward, forcing her to lean directly over him. His breath washed over her face. It smelled of stale adrenaline, dry rot, and the sick, sweet scent of internal bleeding. Up close, the damage was even more apparent. Deep, permanent lines of exhaustion were etched around his eyes. Sweat cut clean, pale tracks through the soot layered on his cheeks. "I will break your neck," he whispered. It wasn't an arrogant boast. It was a simple, absolute statement of fact. Camilla didn't pull away. If she pulled away, the ketamine dart would go into his shoulder, his already crashing blood pressure would plummet into the abyss, and he would die on this table surrounded by strangers. She forced herself to look directly into his pale grey eyes. Beneath the flat, winter water coldness, she saw the dilation of his pupils, the primal terror masked by sheer violence. She leaned in just an inch closer. Her lips were mere inches from his dirt-crusted ear. "Stand down, Wraith," she whispered. The effect was instantaneous. The violent, coiled tension rippling through his massive frame completely stalled. The iron grip on her arm didn't release, but it froze, the muscles locking tightly in place. His breath hitched, catching painfully in his chest. "Echo Actual is holding the line," she murmured softly, referencing the old comms check protocol she used to run with him every night in the dark. "But you need to stand down. Right now." Slowly, agonizingly, the man turned his head against the thin pillow. His nose brushed against her cheek. The rough, dirt-caked stubble scratched her skin. He looked at her face, truly looking at her for the very first time. The feral, unseeing glaze in his eyes flickered, breaking apart like shattered ice, revealing the exhausted, broken man trapped underneath. "Echo," he breathed out. The word barely carried any sound. "Yeah," Camilla whispered back, her vision blurring slightly. "It's Echo. Let me fix the vest, Wraith. Let me work." His grip on her arm loosened, the heavy fingers uncurled, sliding off her scrubs and falling limply to his side. The fight drained out of him all at once, his head dropping back with a wet thud. His chest continued to heave, but the snarling finally stopped. "Do it," he muttered, his eyes fluttering shut. Camilla stood up straight. Her arm throbbed violently where his fingers had dug in. She turned back to the medical team. Alan and Sarah were staring at her, frozen in utter shock, the uninjected syringe still held aloft. "Cancel the ketamine," Camilla said. Her voice was finally steady. She reached behind her for the heavy metal shears resting on the flipped tray. "Get me 4 packs of combat gauze, a liter of warm saline, and a fresh suture kit." "He's compliant." Alan blinked rapidly, lowering the syringe. What did you just say to him?" "Nothing," Camilla lied, turning her back to the surgeon. She drove the blunt end of the shears into the thick, ruined fabric of his vest and began to cut. "I just told him the truth." She focused entirely on the physical task to keep her hands from shaking again. The sharp smell of the iodine, the slick, wet sound of the fabric parting, the sickening crunch of the old, hardened gauze as she pulled the temporary field dressing away from the gaping wound. He didn't flinch. He just lay there, bleeding under the dying fluorescent lights, trusting his life to the ghost from the radio. Dust settled heavily over the recovery ward, coating the plastic IV bags and heart monitors in a fine, gritty film. Time dissolved into a monotonous blur of vital checks and changing bedpans. 48 hours had passed since the surgery. Trauma Bay 4 had already been scrubbed, sanitized, and restained with the fluids of a dozen other broken men. Camilla stood by the sink in the corner, aggressively scrubbing her hands with harsh antibacterial soap. Her skin was raw, peeling around the cuticles, and her lower back screamed with a dull, continuous ache. She stared blindly at the rusted drain. Saving a life in the heat of a trauma code was a rush of pure, thoughtless adrenaline. The aftermath, however, was always agonizingly slow, stripped of all glory. She dried her hands on a scratchy paper towel and turned toward bed number 7. Graham Locke was awake. He didn't look heroic. He looked like a man who had been dragged backward through a meat grinder. His skin held the sickly, translucent pallor of severe blood loss, offset by the violent purple and yellow mottling of deep tissue bruising across his chest. He was staring at the canvas ceiling of the tent, perfectly still, except for the shallow, guarded rise and fall of his ribs. Approaching his bed, Camilla felt a ridiculous flutter of anxiety in her stomach. She ruthlessly squashed it. She was exhausted, running on stale crackers and lukewarm coffee, and she didn't have the emotional bandwidth for a dramatic reunion. "Time to change the dressing," she announced. Her voice came out flatter than she intended. Graham didn't flinch, but his pale grey eyes slowly tracked over to her. He watched her set the metal tray on the rolling table. He didn't say a word as she snapped a pair of latex gloves over her raw knuckles. The silence between them was thick, suffocating, entirely different from the comfortable radio static they used to share. Voices didn't sweat. Voices didn't smell like iodine, stale sweat and fear. "Sit up slightly. If you feel tearing, tell me," Camilla instructed, her tone strictly clinical. He gripped the aluminum railing of the cot. His knuckles turned white as he leveraged his weight, pulling himself up a few inches. A sharp hiss of air escaped his teeth, but he didn't complain. Peeling the surgical tape off a hairy abdomen was never a gentle process. Camilla tried to be quick, pulling the adhesive away from his skin with steady, firm tugs. The sharp, metallic scent of dried blood hit the air, mingling with the chemical bite of the chlorhexidine swab she held in her other hand. "You're shorter than I pictured," Graham rasped suddenly. Camilla's hand jerked. The tape snapped back against his raw skin. He grunted, his jaw locking tight. "Sorry," she muttered, heat flooding her cheeks. She focused intently on the ugly, stapled incision bisecting his stomach. "And you're much heavier than you sounded. You almost dislocated my shoulder when they brought you in." "Didn't ask to be brought in," he replied, his voice a low, gravelly vibration that sent an unwelcome shiver down her spine. "Right. You were doing a fantastic job bleeding to death in the dirt." Camilla tossed the ruined gauze into the biohazard bin with more force than necessary. She ripped open a fresh, sterile pad. "Next time you want to die on your own terms, Locke, wear a Do Not Resuscitate tag. Would save us all a lot of ruined inventory." He chuckled, but the sound quickly broke into a wet, agonizing cough. He pressed a heavy, scarred hand over his stomach, his eyes squeezing shut until the spasm passed. 14 months, Camilla said quietly. The words slipped out before her cynical filter could stop them. She pressed the fresh gauze over his stitches, pressing down hard to secure the tape. "You went completely dark. Echo Station tried to raise Corvus Company for 3 weeks. Nothing." Graham's head rolled back against the thin pillow. He stared at the ceiling again, the brief flash of grim humor completely erased from his face. "Corvus is gone," he said. The absolute deadness in his tone made Camilla stop moving. "Mortar strike wiped the convoy. I dug 2 of my men out of the sand. They bled out in the back of a stolen transport truck before I could hit a friendly checkpoint." She looked at him. Really looked at him. The deep grooves around his mouth weren't just from physical exhaustion. They were carved by a suffocating survivor's guilt. This wasn't a soldier fighting for a flag. This was a man who had lost his entire world in a desert miles away from anywhere that mattered, and he had been carrying the rotting weight of it alone for over a year. "I'm sorry," she whispered, the professional detachment fully crumbling. "Don't be," Graham muttered, refusing to look at her. He pulled the scratchy, olive-drab hospital blanket up over his chest, shivering slightly despite the sweltering heat of the ward. "Mercenaries don't get funerals, Echo. We just get replaced. You shouldn't have stopped that surgeon from putting me under. Would have been a hell of a lot easier to just let it fade out." Camilla gripped the edge of the metal tray. A flash of pure, irrational anger burned in her chest. "You don't get to do that!" She snapped, her voice low but vibrating with fury. She leaned over the bed, forcing him to look at her. "You don't get to sit in my ear for a year, making me care whether you live or die, and then tell me I should have let you flatline on my table. I am sick of bagging bodies. I am sick of washing blood off my shoes. So excuse me if I decided to be entirely selfish and keep one goddamn person alive." Graham stared at her. The feral, cornered animal look from the trauma bay was completely gone, replaced by something much more dangerous. Vulnerability. He reached out, his thick, calloused fingers wrapping loosely around her wrist. The touch wasn't a threat this time. It was a lifeline. "Camilla," he said, using her real name for the first time. The sound of it in his wrecked voice made her chest ache. She didn't pull away. She stood there in the stifling, dust-filled tent, listening to the erratic beep of his heart monitor, feeling the rough texture of his thumb brushing against her racing pulse. For a brief, terrible moment, the war outside didn't exist. "Your vitals are stable," she managed to say, her voice thick. She gently pulled her arm free, picking up her medical tray. "Get some sleep, Locke. I have rounds." She walked away quickly, her boots squeaking against the linoleum. She didn't look back, entirely terrified of what she might do if she did. 3 nights later, The distant, rhythmic thud of heavy artillery shook the foundation of the base. Shadows danced erratically across the canvas walls of the ward, cast by the spinning amber lights of a transport chopper touching down on the nearby helipad. Camilla sat at the nurse's station, rubbing her burning eyes. Her shift had ended 2 hours ago, but her cot in the barracks felt too far away. A quiet, distinctly metallic click snapped her awake. She stood up, peering down the dimly lit row of beds. Bed 7 was empty. The thin blanket was thrown aside, and the IV pole stood abandoned, a few drops of clear saline still beeping steadily onto the floor. Panic, cold and sharp, spiked in her chest. She hurried down the aisle, her hands instinctively curling into fists. Graham was in the supply vestibule near the rear exit. He was sitting on a stack of wooden crates, his face pale and dripping with sweat, aggressively tying the laces of a battered pair of combat boots. He had scavenged a pair of desert camouflage pants from the donation bin and was wearing a black, generic tactical shirt that stretched tight over his fresh bandages. "You will tear your stitches within 10 miles, Camilla said, stepping into the vestibule. He didn't jump. He just paused, taking a slow, ragged breath before hauling himself to his feet. He swayed slightly, leaning heavily against the corrugated tin wall for support. "Transport chopper is heading to a green zone in Kandahar," Graham said, his voice tight with pain. He avoided her eyes, focusing instead on securing a stolen utility belt around his waist. "Pilot owes me a favor. I'm catching a ride. You are medically unfit to walk, let alone ride in a vibrating metal box for 4 hours. Camilla countered, stepping directly into his path to the door. "Dr. Allen hasn't cleared you. I haven't cleared you." "I don't need clearance, Camilla. I need to leave." "Why?" She threw her hands up, the frustration finally boiling over. "To go shoot at shadows? To go die in a different ditch? You barely survived the last one, Graham. Your body is literally holding itself together with medical staples and sheer stubbornness." Graham stopped moving. He looked down at her, the harsh shadows of the vestibule carving deep, severe lines into his face. He looked exhausted, broken, and dangerously resolute, because sitting in that bed is going to kill me faster than a bullet, he said quietly. He took a step closer, his towering frame forcing Camilla to tilt her head up. "I don't know how to do this, Camilla. I don't know how to sit in a sterile room and pretend the world outside isn't burning. I don't belong here. I belong out there. It's the only thing that makes sense." Camilla swallowed hard, the bitter taste of defeat coating her tongue. She wanted to scream at him. She wanted to tell him he was a coward for running back to a war instead of facing the quiet. But she looked into his pale grey eyes and saw the absolute, uncompromising truth. He was a weapon. Weapons didn't sit on shelves. They rusted if they weren't used. "You're a cynic and a fool," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. "I know," he agreed softly. He reached up, his large hand gently cupping the side of her neck. His thumb brushed over her jawline. The touch was incredibly tender, a massive contradiction to the calloused, violent nature of his hands. Camilla closed her eyes, leaning into the warmth for just a second, committing the smell of him, antiseptic, dust, and raw masculinity, to memory. Graham pulled back slowly. He reached under the collar of his black shirt and unclasped the heavy silver chain. He pressed the blackened metal disc, the Corvus Company insignia, into the palm of her hand, closing her fingers tightly around it. "Echo Actual," he murmured, a sad, crooked smile touching the corners of his mouth. "Signing off." "Don't you dare die out there, Wraith!" Camilla commanded, her voice thick with unshed tears. "I am not tracking down your body to get my tape and gauze back." He let out a short, painful laugh. He turned, pushing open the heavy metal door. The deafening roar of the chopper blades flooded the vestibule, bringing with it a chaotic swirl of desert sand and the sharp smell of aviation fuel. Camilla stood in the doorway, clutching the cold metal bird in her fist, watching him limp toward the spinning rotors. He didn't look back. He just melted into the darkness, a ghost returning to the shadows, leaving her standing in the sterile, unquiet light of the trauma ward. Did Camilla's whisper just save Wraith's life, or pull them both into a deadlier crossfire? The trauma ward is only the beginning of their battle. If you felt every ragged breath and pounding heartbeat of this story, hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. We drop gritty, deeply human audio dramas just like this every single week. Don't miss the rest of Camilla and Wraith's journey. Share this video with a friend who loves intense, grounded storytelling right now.